The Lord be for us, be against us. Turn now to the Westminster Magazine, the Craig Center. It's a research and think tank at Westminster Seminary. The Craig Center for the Study of the Westminster Standards at Westminster Theological Seminary was established in 2002 to facilitate the study of and education about the Westminster Assembly, its writings, members, and theology. As a formal research center at Westminster, the center endeavors to contribute to the spiritual and intellectual life of Westminster Seminary by equipping students and laymen with the knowledge of the historical, systematic, biblical, and practical contours of the Reformed theology for which the seminary stands. To that end, the center undertakes a number of specialized projects ranging from the creation of bibliographies, the collection of relevant materials, and encouraging further research and scholarly discussion through seminaries and conferences. It can be followed on Facebook at the Craig Center for updates on upcoming seminars, announcements, and content related to the Westminster Assembly. Now we turn to modern Reformation and what has become of American fundamentalism, an article by Dr. George Marsden. He's taken a little detour on Trumpian white evangelicals. Now, it looks like he's shifting to theology, we hope. The theological seminaries associated with these movements, together with many associated ministries, Christian colleges and universities, and Christian presses, have remained dedicated to strengthening the theological and principle base of American evangelicals. Alliances with educated British evangelicals have played an important role as well. In many ways, the movement has sought to deepen evangelical thought. It has succeeded. In the past half century, there has been something of a renaissance of traditionalist Christian scholarship, not only in theology and biblical studies, but in philosophy and almost every other intellectual discipline. Yet, given the populist and market-driven nature of the numerically dominant parts of American evangelicalism, it may seem as though some thoughtful efforts have been of little consequence. If one lumps together all of American evangelicalism, or all of white American evangelicalism, which is what the politically oriented pollsters do, then it may seem as though there is an insurmountable evangelical mind-body problem. For instance, health and wealth, Pentecostal megachurch ministries, to cite one major set of movements, have far larger numerical influence than all the seminaries and related ministries grounded in a more thoughtful and deeply grounded theology. Such tendencies should not, however, lead us to give up entirely on the popular forms of evangelicalism. One way to think positively about what has been happening is that the massive populist ministries, anti-intellectual tendencies, and fundamentalist-like absolutism of American evangelicalism continue to provide fertile ground for deeper renewal. Very often, people who are brought into the faith through these popular ministries find richer understandings of the faith in the older theological tradition, such as the Reformed. This is one reason why traditionalist reform ministries have been growing in the 21st century, even if they remain a relatively small percentage of the whole of evangelicalism. As Richard Lovelace argued in his classic Dynamics of Spiritual Life, if there is to be an evangelical revival, the various parts of the body need one another. Although the past decade has seen some decline in the number of Americans who identify as evangelicals, especially young people. If we think of fundamentalism in its original 1920 sense, then it has been in some ways a story of remarkable success. During the early years when fundamentalists meant Bible-believing Christians who resisted liberal theologies, it was commonplace for mainstream observers to predict that the movement would die away as a rural culture faded and science-based education advanced. And even though the early fundamentalists lost in their campaigns to purge liberalism from the major northern denominations, they were not the ones who died away. By the latter decades of the 20th century, it was the mainline, theologically inclusive Protestant denominations that experienced sharp declines in membership. In the meantime, those who preached something like the old-time gospel were thriving. Even though populist and anti-intellectual appeals have had much to do with that success, theological renewal movements played a supporting role. In the 1920s, one of the reasons why critics of fundamentalism were so confident that modernist outlooks would prevail was because they were convinced that traditional gospel beliefs could not be sustained intellectually in a modern scientific world. Yet after a century of substantial biblical, philosophical, and other scholarship, it now seems that traditionalist Bible-based theologies are intellectually defensible. Finally, on the positive side, it is important to recognize that the century after the rise of fundamentalism, evangelicalism has become primarily a global phenomenon. Some of the earliest manifestations of fundamentalist modernist conflicts were on the mission fields. Now, in the majority world, it is clearly the more traditionalist gospel emphasis that has spread remarkably beyond almost any predictions. Those phenomena are especially helpful for putting the present state of American evangelicalism in perspective. Whatever one might think of the recent political turn within American white evangelical communities, this can be seen as a drop in the bucket if one is looking at global evangelism as a whole. At the same time, however, it must be acknowledged that parts of the world evangelicalism have some of the same sorts of populist tendencies that have always been a part of American evangelicalism. The health and wealth gospel is the clearest example. Still, we should view the popular spread of a gospel-based Christianity throughout the world as a positive work of the Holy Spirit, even as we hope that, among other good things, it helps open the way for versions of that gospel message more deeply grounded in substantial heritages of biblical and theological formation. This article is by Dr. George Marsden. He's the Francis McEnany Professor of History Emeritus at the University of Notre Dame. His works include Fundamentalism and American Culture, Oxford Press, 1980. He's also co-editor with Mark Knoll and David Bebbington, the evangelicals, who they have been, are now, and could be. Ordinance 2019. We will call that to an end as we shift to the Westminster Theological Journal. Dr. Richard Cogley, Puritan New England, the New Israel. He's arguing against the thesis of Sarkvan Berkovich. Both Anglicans and English Puritans adopted phrases like all true-hearted Israelites and this our Israel. And they substituted England for Israel or Jerusalem. Let me say, as once Moses did, the name Israel being changed to England. Richard Bernard stated in a discussion on Deuteronomy 10, 12, and 13, rejoice with Jerusalem, let the name be changed. Rejoice ye with England. Jeremy Burroughs said of Isaiah 66:10, Protestants in England have also compared figures in their national history to ancient Israelite worthies. Edward VI is the new Josiah. James I is the British Solomon. Queen Elizabeth is another Deborah, or even another David. Oliver Cromwell as Gideon Redivivus. Berkovich recognized that he needed to distinguish Anglicans and English Puritans from American Puritans because for him, only the latter saw themselves as antitypes of the original chosen people. This crucial distinction he made in two ways. The first was by contending that in England and elsewhere in Europe, there was no fusion of secular and sacred history, as there had been in ancient Israel, and as there supposedly was antitypical in New England. He was inconsistent, however, about whether it was the secular or sacred which prevented the fusion. He stated on one occasion that in England, appeals to ancient Israel pertained exclusively to mundane social matters, to the city of man rather than the city of God, and on that he is wrong. On the other hand, that England, such appeals concerned redemptive history as distinct from secular history. That's not going to work either. But either way, secular or sacred have minimal value as analytical categories for interpreting early modern European cultures where church and state were united. Berkovich's second strategy in this case, one he consistently followed, was to claim that the Protestants in England were speaking metaphorically, not typologically, whenever they likened in England to Israel or Virginia to Canaan. Outside of New England, ancient Israel served as an analogy, precedent, and moral exemplum, but not a self-referential type. Not so, Berkovich. Wow, the confidence of that thesis is being blown apart. Now we turn to Mid-America Journal, where Mr. Walther is baffled gabbing on translations. Jews, Christians, and pagans alike have long recognized the difficulty of translating between two languages and the miscommunication that can occur by a direct translation that adheres too closely to the source language. Thus, Ben Sira, prologue to the Sirach, notes what was originally expressed in Hebrew does not have exactly the same sense when translated into another language. Jerome, one of the earliest and most influential Bible translators, quotes with approval from the preface to a work on the life of St. Anthony. A A literal translation from one to another obscures the sense. The exuberance of the growth lessens the yield. For while one's diction is enslaved to cases and metaphors, it has to be to explain by tedious circumlocutions what a few words would otherwise have sufficed to make plain. Leave others to catch at syllables and letters. Do you, for your part, look for the meaning? Jerome was wrong there, although he was a great scholar. He was wrong on other points. Jerome also quotes two Roman writers from the 1st century BC as espousing a less than essentially literal translation method. Cicero explains, I have not supposed myself to bound to pay the words out of one by one to the reader, but only to give him an equivalent in value. Horace advises, and care not with over anxious thought to render word for word. About a millennium after Jerome, Luther carried out another historically significant translation, rendering the Hebrew and Greek scriptures into German for the first time. He explains that accurately conveying the sense of the text and not woodenly following the forms of the original language is the task of the translator. Whoever would speak German must not use Hebrew style. Rather, he must see to it, once he understands the Hebrew author, that he concentrates on the sense of the text. His goal was the clear language that would be understandable to everyone. We have taken care to use language that is clear and that everybody can understand without perverting the sense and the meaning. We will pick that up. We turn to Anglican and Episcopal history. The article by Dr. Robert Wright on the painter Thomas Cole in the Episcopal Church. His paintings reflect 4 stages of life: childhood, youth, manhood, adulthood, and elderly. The childhood painting: a stream is issuing from a deep cavern in a craggy and precipitous mountain, whose summit is hidden in the clouds. From out of a cave glides a boat, whose golden prow and sides are sculptured into the figures of the hours, steered by an angelic form, and laden with buds and flowers. It bears a laughing infant, the voyager, whose varied course the artist has attempted to delineate. On either bank, the banks of the stream are clothed with luxuriant herbage and flowers. The rising sun bathes the mountains and flowery banks in rosy light. The deep cavern is emblematic of our earthly origin and mysterious past. The boat, composed of figures of the hours, images the thought that we are born on the hours down the stream of life. The boat identifies the subject in each picture: the rosy light of morning, luxuriant flowers and plants are emblems of the joyousness of early life. The close banks and the limited scope of the scene indicate the narrow experience of childhood and the nature of its pleasures and desires. The Egyptian lotus in the foreground of the picture is symbolical of human life. Joyousness and wonder are the characteristic emotions of childhood. And then for the painting on youth. The stream now continues its course through the landscape of the wider scope and more diversified beauty. Trees of rich growth overshadow the banks. Verdant hills form the base of lofty mountains. The infant of the former scene is now a youth on the verge of manhood. He is now alone in the boat and takes the helm himself. And in an attitude of confidence and eager expectation, gazes on a cloudy pile of architecture, an air-built castle that rises dome above dome in the far-off blue sky. The guardian spirit stands on the bank of the stream, and with serious yet benignant countenance seems to be bidding the impetuous voyager Godspeed. The beautiful stream flows directly toward the aerial palace for distance, but at length makes a sudden turn and is seen in glimpses beneath the trees until at last descends with a rapid current into the rocky ravine where the voyager will be found in the next picture. Over the remote hills which seem to intercept the stream and turn it from its hitherto direct course, a path is dimly seen, tending directly toward the cloudy fabric. The scenery of this picture, clear stream, lofty trees, towering mountains in unbounded distance, and transparent atmosphere, figure forth the romantic beauty of youthful imaginings, when the mind magnifies the mean and the common into the magnificent, before experience teaches what is the real. The gorgeous cloud-built palace, whose most glorious domes seem yet but half revealed to the eye, growing more and more lofty as we gaze, is emblematic of the daydreams of youth, its aspirations after glory and fame, and the dimly seen path would intimate that youth in his impetuous career is forgetful that he is embarked on the stream of life, and the current sweeps along with resistless force and increases in swiftness as it descends toward the great ocean of eternity. Very colorful, thoughtful artwork by Thomas Cole. Now turn to the Churchmen and Dr. Donald West's article about Jesus's cry from the cross in Mark 5:34. The cry from the cross itself is composed as an address and complaint. The address, my God, does not, as some think, imply that God, Jesus senses greater distance from God than in his Gethsemane prayer, where he uses the address, Abba, Father. Apart from the fact that Jesus is quoting scripture in his prayer, which he is not free to change, the phrase, my God, is probably an individual appropriation of covenant terminology. Like the psalmist, Jesus is calling out to God who promised to be with his people and not forsake them, several verses. The complaint of Psalm 22:1 is couched in the question, why? An expression of protest in the lament psalms that presses God to explain his delay in helping, especially his absence. In this instance, God is asked why he has forsaken Jesus. The psalmist often asks God not to forsake them, several psalms. Richard Baucham's gloss on the Hebrew verb behind the word forsake, used here, Izav, conveys the sense well. To be abandoned and rejected by God, who withholds his gracious intervention and leaves the psalmist to suffer and die. In Psalm 22:1a, the abandonment complained about is not potential, but real. Jesus' anguished cry for help arises as he faces the darkness of judgment and senses the removal of the Father's presence. Very nice. We shift now to the Protestant Reformed Theological Journal, a new article. We finished the centennial article on the history of the seminary. This article is entitled Calvin's Only Letter to Luther. A lot of water behind that bridge. On January 20, 1545, John Calvin sent a letter to Martin Luther. The letter and circumstances surrounding its writing and reception ought to be more well known than they are. Set in its historical context, the letter reveals in a unique way Calvin's high view of biblical worship, hints at the significance of the difference between Calvin and Luther's view of worship, and also uncovers something of the relational dynamics between Luther and other reformers towards the end of his life. What follows is the letter of itself and my setting forth of its context, content, and significance. Letter from Calvin to Martin Luther, January 20, 1545. My honored father, being assured that many of my fellow countrymen in France, having turned from the darkness of popery to the pure light of the gospel, have notwithstanding been backward to change their open profession, and therefore continue to pollute themselves with the horrors of popery, as if they had no knowledge of pure doctrine. Being informed of this, I could not refrain from assailing such sloth and indifference with the severity with which I think they deserve. For what kind of faith is that which remains buried in the recesses of the soul and never declares itself by an open confession? This actually is taken from Paul Henry's Life of Calvin. Wow, we're reviewing that in the Protestant Reformed Journal here momentarily. What kind of witness is that which shrinks concealed behind a hypocritical respect for Catholic idolatry? But I will not here discuss this matter, of which I have treated in 2 little writings, from which you may easily learn, if you be pleased to look over them, what my opinion is and upon what ground it rests. Some of our brethren, aroused by reading these papers, have awaked from the slumber in which they were sunk and begin to consider what it is their duty to do. But since it is a hard thing either to exercise such self-denial as to expose one's life to danger, or to bring upon ourselves the hatred of the whole world through opposition to its customs and opinions, and to suffer the loss of country and poverty, and to be an voluntary exile, so it is that many have found themselves unable not to persevere in their resolution. We'll pick this up again. This is late in Luther's life. And Calvin, at this point in 1535, is a 36-year-old man. Now we turn to the Reformed Theological Journal and Dr. Scott Swain on the Psalms and the Christian life. Psalm 1 and 2 introduce the 2 themes we have already discussed regarding the good life in connection to God's anointed king. On one ancient and well-established reading, the blessed man of Psalm 1, who travels the way of the righteous, is first and foremost the king, who serves as exemplar and guide for the blessed life. More explicitly, Psalm 2 promises blessedness to those who take refuge in the King, the object of divine begetting and recipient of the divine promises, whom God has installed on his holy hill. In Psalm 16, God's anointed king addresses God as the supreme good and final end, in whose presence there is fullness of joy, at whose right hand are pleasures evermore. And he addresses God as the one who makes known to him the path of life. God's anointed king is both beatitude in person and the means to our beatitude in fellowship with him. The oil of gladness, Psalm 45:7, poured on the king's head, runs down his beard and saturates his body, causing his people to rejoice in him, Psalm 133:2. For this reason, the king's suffering in the Psalter is an occasion of lament. Quote, "Behold our shield, O God. Look on the face of your anointed," Psalm 84:10. While the king's exaltation is cause for the celebration, may his name endure forever. His fame continue as long as the sun. May people be blessed in him. All nations call him blessed. Psalm 72:17. To speak of God's anointed king in this manner is to speak in light of the Psalm's fulfillment in the apostolic announcement of Jesus Christ and his coming. But this evangelical speech, enabled by apostolic announcement, answers to the speech of the Psalter as well. Through the speech of the Psalms, the to-be incarnate Son of God presents himself to us in riddle and in promise as the one in whom the good life finds fulfillment. God's anointed king is not simply one theme among others in the Psalms. Properly speaking, he is not a theme at all. In the Psalms, God's anointed king is the personal object of divine and human address. Psalm 2, Psalm 45, Psalm 110. In the Psalms, we hear his voice offering lament and laud to God, promising to proclaim God's name to his siblings and to give God praise in the midst of the congregation. Grace is poured upon your lips, Psalm 45:2 declares, because in the Psalms, God's anointed king sings us into God's kingdom. We'll call that an end, a very delightful article, as we turn to Henry's Life of Calvin. Calvin is almost without parallel. When engaged upon his institutes, he's often passed whole nights without sleep and whole days without food. And as our biographer observes, this is the more striking when placed in contrast with the almost convivial life of Luther, whose beaker was daily filled with wine from the cellar of the council, and who discoursed almost as freely on sacred things at the table as in the church. At the same time, it is but just to say that Luther was no richer than Calvin. Erasmus has said, Lutherus pauper multos facit divitis. Their motto was that of the apostle, poor yet making many rich. And the reader may safely be left to judge whether in our time and country we have gained much by the exchange of these indigent men for moneyed manufacturing, banking, stock jobbing ministers, clerical directors of ironworks and cottonworks, mercantile adventures, preachers of self-denial whose names and notes are familiar in Wall Street, and who with more than missionary zeal extend their operations to the Great West, adding field to field and winning over the tracts of that wealthy country not more by the gospel than by skillful speculation. Ere long, the story of popish bishops and cardinals will have been antiquated and needless. When Cardinal Satellite was once traveling through Geneva incognito, he was sieged with a desire of seeing the reformer who had written against him. He expected to find him in a palace, or at least a sumptuous dwelling, surrounded by a retinue of servants. What was his surprise when a small, ignoble house was pointed out, and when on his knocking the door was opened by Calvin himself, clad in the simplest garb. The cardinal, astonished to find in such circumstances so celebrated a man, could not refrain from expressions of wonder. But Calvin begged him to observe that that in his actions he had not taken counsel of flesh and blood. He had previously said to this very Satellite, "I do not willingly speak of myself, but since you do not suffer me to be silent, I will say what is not inconsistent with modesty. If I have sought my own aggrandizement, I should never have retired from your faction." Notwithstanding all this, Calvin found it frequently necessary. Trouble populating. We'll pick this up in another occasion. If the Lord be for us, who can be against us? It is God who justifies. Who can lay anything to the charge of God's elect? If God sent forth his Son freely and voluntarily, him dying in our behalf, will he not rise? Will he not give us all things? Him who has risen for our justification, risen to the right hand of God as our intercessor. Nothing shall separate us from the love of God, which is in Christ Jesus our Lord. Until next time, Godspeed.